Good evening and welcome back. Tonight we'll spend some quiet time with the world of Greek mythology, moving slowly through its gods, its heroes, its sacred places, and the strange, beautiful stories that have lasted for so many centuries. Some of these stories were told beside hearths, some in temples, some in poetry, and some in the soft spaces between belief and memory. If you enjoy these calm journeys, you're always welcome to like, subscribe, or leave a gentle comment about where you're listening from tonight, or what ancient world you might like to drift into next. Now settle in, let the room grow softer around you, and allow the old stories to unfold at an easy pace. We'll begin with the mythology itself, and let it open slowly like a map in the dark. Greek mythology was never contained within a single book, and it never existed as one official, finalized version. It was a living body of stories, carried for centuries through poetry, song, recitation, ritual, sculpture, festival, and memory. Because of that, the same god, goddess, or hero could look slightly different from one place to another. A story told in a coastal city might sound different from the version preserved inland. A poet might emphasize a deity's kindness, while another might dwell on the same figure's severity, vanity, or mystery. Even the names and family ties of certain figures could shift depending on the tradition. This was not seen as a flaw so much as a natural part of myth itself. The stories were flexible enough to survive changing times. They were not locked into place. They moved quietly with the people who remembered them, and in that movement they remained alive. Many of the Greek myths that are familiar today survive because poets such as Homer and Hesiod gave them enduring shape in verse. Their work was never just simple storytelling. It helped establish a shared imaginative world in which gods, mortals, monsters, and ancient heroes all belonged to the same broad cosmic order. Homer's epics especially gave later generations a powerful sense of the heroic age, while Hesiod's poetry arranged the gods and the origins of the universe into a more deliberate pattern. Yet even these famous texts are only part of the whole. They do not preserve every local version, every sacred custom, or every older tale that once circulated by word of mouth. There were temple traditions, regional legends, hymns sung in honor of particular gods, and stories that may never have been written down at all. Much of mythic Greece, then, exists like a shadow behind the surviving texts. We can still see its outlines, even if we cannot recover every detail. The Greek gods were often understood as immensely powerful, but not distant in the way some later traditions imagine divinity. They were close to life, active in it, and often deeply involved in its smallest turns. A god might be thought to influence weather, harvests, healing, love, dreams, seafaring, childbirth, or the outcomes of war. A sudden wind, an unexpected fever, a fortunate meeting, or a difficult crossing of the sea might all be interpreted as signs of divine attention. And yet the gods were not always comforting. They could be proud, quick to anger, difficult to please, or simply indifferent to human wishes. In myth, the divine world often feels like an enlarged version of society itself, with alliances, rivalries, favors, and grudges. That closeness made the gods feel immediate, but it also made them unpredictable. The world was never entirely secure, and the stories seem to understand that unease with great clarity. The earliest Greek stories also reveal a deep feeling that the world had layers, and that the visible surface of things was only part of a larger reality. Mountains were not merely mountains. Springs, caves, groves, islands, and remote shorelines could all be more than scenery. They might be places where a god had appeared, where a nymph was believed to dwell, or where the boundary between mortal life and divine presence felt especially thin. A single stone, tree, or fountain could carry memory and significance. Some groves were sacred and carefully protected. Some streams were spoken of as living presences. Some caves were imagined as entrances to hidden realms, or as ancient dwelling places of gods, giants, or chthonic powers. In that world, landscape was never passive. It participated in meaning. Myth transformed the natural world into something quietly animated, a place where every ridge and hollow could suggest a story waiting beneath the surface. Zeus eventually became the most widely recognized ruler of the gods, but his kingship in myth is more complicated than the image of a perfectly absolute sovereign. He is undeniably powerful. He commands thunder, oversees order, and stands at the summit of the divine family. Yet he is not beyond restriction. Even Zeus exists within an older cosmic framework shaped by fate, inherited order, and the deep laws of the universe. Greek myth often presents him as the chief power, but not as a power that can erase everything before it. His authority is real, but it is not limitless. He negotiates, punishes, protects, and decides, yet there are times when even he seems to work within patterns already set in motion. This is one reason Greek mythology feels so textured and human. It does not imagine power as smooth or simple. Instead, it shows power as something that must still contend with necessity, custom, and the enduring shape of the world. Hera is often remembered, especially in later retellings, for jealousy and wrath, but that is only one strand of a much larger divine identity. She was also associated with marriage, legitimacy, household order, and the formal bonds that made family life and royal succession possible. Her presence in myth often reflects the importance of structure and continuity. Marriage was not merely a private affair. It helped stabilize inheritance, lineage, and the transfer of power between generations. In this sense, Hera's role reaches far beyond the domestic. She stands at the intersection of family and authority, intimacy and law. Her dignity, her pride, and her fierce defense of her place can all be understood within that larger symbolic framework. To the Greeks, the stability of a household and the stability of a kingdom were not entirely separate concerns. Both could be imagined through divine order, and Hera presided over the deep seriousness of that order. Poseidon, meanwhile, was one of the most vital gods in a world shaped by islands, coastal settlements, harbors, and constant movement across water. For the Greeks, the sea was never just a scenic horizon. It was a living force of trade, travel, danger, communication, and uncertainty. A voyage could bring wealth, but it could also bring loss. A wind could shift without warning. A calm surface could become violent very quickly. To speak of Poseidon was to speak to the unstable boundary between safety and risk. His power over the sea made him central not only to sailors, but to anyone whose life depended on weather, transport, or maritime exchange. His character in myth often mirrors the sea itself, immense, forceful, changeable, and difficult to fully trust. He could be generous, but he could also be terrifying. In that sense, Poseidon belongs to the Greek world as a reminder that the environment itself was always part of religious thought. The myths also reveal an intense interest in ancestry, lineage, and inherited identity. Heroes are rarely isolated figures. They are usually placed within long family lines that connect them to gods, kings, older dynasties, or legendary founders. These genealogies were not decorative. They explained status, obligation, memory, and destiny. To know a person's ancestry was to understand the world around them more clearly. A hero might inherit strength from one side of the family and tragedy from another. A royal house might be marked by divine favor, but also by ancient guilt or recurring doom. This kind of inherited storytelling gave myth a sense of continuity across generations. It suggested that the past remained active in the present. A family line could carry honor, but it could also carry burden. In this way, Greek mythology worked almost like a vast cultural memory, organizing scattered stories into patterns that made the past feel reachable, meaningful, and still alive. The beauty of that system is that it never fully closes. One hero may have several possible fathers. One goddess may be associated with several different local cults. One event may be explained in more than one way. The myths do not always demand a single answer. Instead, they allow for layers of truth, each one preserving something valuable. That is part of what makes the tradition feel so enduring. It does not behave like a rigid doctrine. It behaves more like a landscape of remembered voices. And when we listen closely, we can hear how each story echoes another, as if the whole tradition were built from conversations that began long before anyone chose to write them down. In many Greek stories, the gods seem less like abstract ideals and more like a powerful society with its own tensions and customs. They quarrel, negotiate, compete, and form alliances. They help some mortals while opposing others. They can be moved by prayer, sacrifice, flattery, or insult. This does not necessarily make them less divine. In the Greek imagination, it often made them more relevant. The gods were not removed from the rhythms of life, they were woven into them. Storms, harvests, births, journeys, and deaths all belonged in the same broad field of divine possibility. A person living in that world might not think of religion as a separate sphere. It was simply part of reality, present in the timing of events, the interpretation of signs, and the unseen weight of ancestral practice. It is also important that much of Greek mythology came from a culture that valued performance as much as text. A story was not always something silently read. It was something heard, repeated, shaped for an audience, and brought to life by voice. That means tone mattered. So did pace, memory, and the setting in which the tale was told. A myth recited at a festival could feel different from a myth embedded in a sacred hymn or a tragic play. The same story might be adapted to suit a local audience, a ceremonial occasion, or a dramatic purpose. This oral quality helped myths remain responsive. They were familiar but not fixed. Even when they were eventually written down, they still carried traces of a world in which telling mattered as much as content. The story was something breathed into being again and again. There is something especially striking about the way Greek mythology treats the past. It is not presented as a simple sequence of dead events. The distant age of gods and heroes remains emotionally near, as though it still casts a light across the present. Old crimes echo into later generations. Ancient favors are remembered. Sacred sites preserve memories of divine presence. A family may live under a blessing or curse that began long before anyone alive can fully explain it. In this sense, myth gives shape to historical feeling, even when it is not history in the modern sense. It tells people where they came from, why certain places matter, why certain customs are observed, and why the world can feel both patterned and unstable at once. Greek mythology holds these questions gently, without rushing to resolve them. And so the Greek world begins not with a single tale, but with a web of tales, each one touching another, each one preserving a different angle of remembrance. Some stories are bright with heroism, some are shadowed by grief, some speak of divine power, while others linger on human fragility. Together they create a tradition that feels expansive and deeply old, a tradition shaped by many voices over many generations. Beneath the familiar names and famous adventures, there is always the faint sense of something older still, as if the myths are carrying forward the quiet sound of voices that have never entirely gone silent. The earliest Greek creation stories begin not with a finished world, but with chaos, a word that can be misleading if taken too literally in the modern sense. It was not simply confusion or violence. It was more like a yawning opening, a vast unformed space, an absence that could still hold possibility. In the oldest poetic traditions, this beginning feels less like a dramatic event than a quiet unfolding, as though the universe is gradually remembering how to exist. From that spacious gap come the earliest divine presences, including Gaia, the earth, and Uranus, the sky. Their emergence is almost intimate. Greek myth so often begins in this way, not with machinery or command, but with relationship, generation, and the slow settling of forms into one another. Gaia, in particular, is one of the most important figures in the earliest layers of myth because she is both a goddess and the earth itself. She is not imagined as a distant ruler looking down on creation from elsewhere. She is the ground underfoot, the soil that receives seed, the hill, the plain, the silent weight that makes all living things possible. That closeness gives her a special dignity in the imagination of ancient Greece. The earth is not inert in these stories. It is active, maternal, and aware. There is something deeply embodied in this way of thinking. The world is not a dead stage on which divine beings appear. The world itself is divine, or at least steeped in divinity, and that makes the early mythic cosmos feel alive in every direction. Uranus, the sky, joins Gaia in one of the foundational generative pairings of Greek myth, and from their union come the Titans, beings belonging to an older and rougher divine generation. These family lines matter enormously in the myths because the gods are rarely isolated individuals. They belong to houses, dynasties, and sacred inheritances. The struggle between one generation and the next is one of the central patterns in the tradition, and it often feels both cosmic and domestic at the same time. The older powers do not simply disappear when they are challenged. They are overthrown, certainly, but they linger beneath the newer order, remembered with awe, resentment, or fear. Greek mythology has a remarkable sense that the past never quite leaves the scene. It remains somewhere under the floorboards of the present. Among these older figures, Cronus stands out as one of the most famous and unsettling. His story is often told in connection with the act of swallowing his own children, a brutal attempt to prevent the prophecy that he himself would be overthrown. It is a grim tale, but it is also symbolically rich. On one level, it speaks of violence within a divine family, of power made monstrous by its own insecurity. On another, it reflects a more universal fear that whatever we possess, especially authority, time, or control, can be taken away. Cronus is sometimes associated in later interpretations with time itself, though this connection is not straightforward in the ancient sources. Still, the feeling is apt. He becomes a figure of devouring inevitability, unable to escape the cycle he tries to stop. In myth, even gods are not free from succession. Zeus eventually defeats Cronus and becomes the chief Olympian, but this victory does not erase the older world. It reorganizes it. That is one of the most characteristic features of Greek myth. The new order is built atop what came before, and the old remains present in altered form. Zeus is a ruler of stability, law, and boundaries, yet his authority is never fully detached from the earlier histories of conflict and force. The cosmos becomes more ordered, but never completely safe. One can almost feel the tension in the background of these stories, as if civilization itself is always only partly secured, resting on layers of memory, struggle, and compromise. The Titanomachy, the great war between the Olympians and the Titans, is one of the grandest conflicts in the Greek mythic tradition. It is often described in broad terms as a cosmic revolution, the moment when the old divine regime is replaced by a new one. But it can also be understood in a quieter, more human way as a story about legitimacy. Who should rule? By what right? Because the Greek gods are family members as much as sovereign powers, questions of authority are inseparable from questions of descent, alliance, and cleverness. Zeus wins not by strength alone, but through a combination of strategy, loyal support, and the shaping of divine relationships. Ancient myth often prefers this layered kind of victory. Power is physical, but it is also social, inherited, and negotiated. There are also older layers of divine presence in Greek mythology that do not always receive as much attention in popular retellings. Figures associated with sea, night, darkness, and the unnamed reaches of the cosmos belong to that deeper strata of myth. They are not always central characters in the most familiar stories, but they help create a sense of depth, as though the visible pantheon is only the surface of a much older and more enigmatic world. In the poetic imagination of the Greeks, darkness is not merely the absence of light, it has a kind of substance. Night can be a mother, the sea can be divine and personified. Such beings remind us that before the clear outlines of the Olympian order there is mystery, and mystery is not empty. It is full of presences that are only partly seen. That feeling of depth is one of the reasons Greek mythology remains so compelling. It rarely offers a simple beginning that closes itself off neatly. Instead, the story suggests strata beneath strata, a world in which the present is always resting on something older and less defined. Even the genealogies become a kind of sacred archaeology. One generation gives rise to another, and each new power inherits not just a domain, but the shadow of what it replaced. This makes Greek myth feel strangely historical, even when it is not history in the modern sense. It remembers the world as if it had been built in layers, with each layer carrying traces of the one below. The repeated cycle of succession, conflict, and replacement may also speak to ordinary human life more directly than it first appears. Families inherit homes and land. Kingship passes from parent to child, sometimes peacefully, sometimes not. Political systems change hands. Older ways of life remain present even after newer ones take hold. Greek myth turns these familiar realities into a cosmic drama, magnifying them until they appear in the sky itself. In that sense, the gods are not so different from human households, only larger, brighter, and more dangerous. The anxieties of inheritance, authority, and loss become visible at the scale of the universe. Even the monsters of early Greek myth can be understood in this same broad pattern. They are not only adversaries for heroes to overcome. They often embody forces that are wild, untamed, or insufficiently ordered by the world humans recognize. A monster may stand for the unknown edge of a landscape, the dangerous energy of nature, or the memory of an earlier age before civilization took shape. When a god or hero defeats such a creature, the story can feel like an echo of the titanomachy itself. The known world pushes back against what came before, but the victory is never absolute. Monsters are slain, yet the need to defend order continues. That lingering uncertainty gives the myths their quiet tension. In many ways, the creation stories do more than explain beginnings. They establish an entire worldview. In that worldview, nothing arises alone. Every being is connected to what came before it, whether through birth, struggle, inheritance, or transformation. The present is not isolated from the past. It is threaded through with it. That may be one reason these myths feel so enduring. They understand that life rarely begins from nothing, and that even the most settled world still contains traces of older darkness. Greek mythology does not hide this fact. It places it at the beginning. The 12 Olympians are often treated as the central family of Greek mythology, though even this number is somewhat flexible in ancient sources. Different lists sometimes shift depending on the city, the period, or the author, and that small uncertainty is itself very Greek in spirit. The pantheon was never a perfectly sealed cabinet of gods arranged once and for all. It was more like a living civic tradition, shaped by local worship, poetry, and memory. Still, the Olympians came to stand as the best-known divine group because they offer a broad image of cosmic life: sky and sea, war and wisdom, fertility and craft, motion and stillness, visible power and hidden influence. In that sense, they are not just a collection of personalities. They are a way of imagining how the world fits together, with each divine figure representing a force that people could honor, fear, or depend on. Apollo is one of the most luminous figures among them, and ancient imagination often placed him in clear light. He is associated with music, prophecy, healing, and the measured clarity of order. His symbols often include the lyre and the laurel, objects that carry a quiet elegance and a sense of refinement. In myth, he can bring relief and guidance, but he can also send plague or punish disrespect, which makes him feel more complete than a purely gentle god. He is not simply kind. He is exacting. That combination of beauty and severity gives him a very Greek quality, because Greek myth often admires form, discipline, and proportion, yet never suggests that these things make life safe or easy. Apollo's presence can feel like the brightness of morning air, but also like the hard edge of truth, where what is hidden becomes visible and cannot easily be ignored. Artemis, Apollo's twin sister, moves through forests, mountains, and moonlight. She is linked to hunting, wild places, young animals, and the thresholds of girlhood, and she seems to belong wherever human society becomes thin and uncertain. In the stories, she is both protector and avenger, loving the untamed world yet fiercely defending her own boundaries. Her presence reminds us that ancient Greece was not only marble cities, paved sanctuaries, and formal processions. It was also hills, groves, cold springs, and remote sanctuaries where the wild still mattered. There is something especially restful in the thought of Artemis, because she represents distance, silence, and the cool independence of places beyond control. She is often imagined with deer, arrows, and a sudden, clean motion through dark trees, as if she were the spirit of the land itself watching from just beyond the firelight. Athene stands for wisdom, strategy, and skilled making. Unlike some warriors in myth, she favors intelligence, planning, and disciplined force rather than reckless clash. She is not opposed to battle, but she tends to make battle thoughtful, ordered, and purposeful. She is also closely tied to Athens, where her importance became a civic symbol woven into the life of the city. The owl associated with her suggests watchfulness, stillness, and clear sight in darkness, a small bird whose quiet gaze fits her character well. Her myths often show that wisdom is not passive. It is a form of action, a readiness to choose well, to see farther, and to shape events instead of merely enduring them. In a culture that respected practical cleverness as much as heroic strength, Athene became a figure of calm intelligence, the kind that can guide a city, a craftsman, or a hero at the exact moment when force alone would fail. Aphrodite, by contrast, governs love, attraction, and desire. She is one of the most powerful gods precisely because she reaches into areas that can never be fully controlled or neatly explained. In stories, her influence is beautiful, disruptive, and often unavoidable. She does not simply cause romance in a modern sense. She awakens the deeper movement of longing, fascination, and attachment that can reshape the whole direction of a life. Love in Greek myth is rarely soft in a simple way. It can inspire joy and tenderness, but it can also produce confusion, rivalry, vanity, jealousy, and heartbreak. Aphrodite belongs to that complicated territory where pleasure and danger mingle. Her presence often arrives with perfume, ornament, tenderness, and sudden vulnerability, yet the result may be anything but gentle. That is part of what makes her so enduring as a mythic figure. She embodies the truth that beauty itself can alter judgment, and that the heart does not always obey reason. Ares represents war in its raw and unsettled form. He is not always admired in myth, and the Greeks often preferred the ordered strength of Athene to the disturbance associated with Ares. This contrast reveals something important about Greek values. Violence was understood as real, unavoidable, and sometimes necessary, but not always noble. Ares is the side of conflict that is loud, immediate, and difficult to justify. He is less about strategy than about the heat of combat, the crash of weapons, and the momentum of anger once it has begun to move. In poetry and story, he can seem imposing, but also somewhat unstable, a god whose force is undeniable yet rarely fully respected. That mixed treatment suggests that the ancient imagination did not deny war's presence, but it did not romanticize its chaos either. Ares stands as a reminder that power without measure can become a kind of disorder, even when it wears armor. Hephaestus, the divine craftsman, brings fire, metalwork, and invention into the house of the gods. His stories often emphasize labor, skill, and the beauty of making, which gives him a different kind of dignity from more radiant or martial deities. He is a reminder that divine power is not only about command. It is also about creation, repair, and the patient shaping of materials. In a world of bronze, tools, furnaces, and workshops, Hephaestus would have felt especially close to the practical realities of life. Ancient listeners may have imagined the sounds of his forge as rhythmic and deep, the glow of hot metal, the smell of smoke and heated iron, the careful motion of hands that know how to transform raw matter into something useful or beautiful. His myths also show that craftsmanship can coexist with woundedness and difficulty. He is often portrayed as limping, and that detail gives his figure an unexpected humanity. He is not flawless, but that imperfection does not diminish him. Instead, it makes his skill more remarkable. Hermes moves quickly between worlds, carrying messages, guiding travelers, and crossing boundaries no one else crosses so easily. He is the god of roads, trade, cunning, and transitions, and his presence often marks a passage from one state to another. He can stand at doorways, along paths, at borders, and at the places where ordinary rules become less stable. His speed makes him feel almost like motion itself, as if he belongs less to a fixed location than to the act of moving through space. In myth, he often appears at the turning points of stories, where one condition becomes another and the outcome has not yet settled. He is also linked with cleverness, and not always in a morally simple way. His intelligence can be playful, evasive, and sly. That makes him a god of negotiation and ambiguity, the kind of divine figure suited to merchants, messengers, and anyone who must cross from one world into another with care. He brings the sense that life is full of thresholds, and that some of the most important things happen in transit. And then there is Hestia, quietly present at the hearth. She is not always the most dramatic Olympian, but perhaps that is precisely why she matters so much. The hearth was the center of home and community life, and Hestia gives divine form to that steady center. Her association is with fire that is maintained rather than unleashed, warmth that endures rather than flares. In mythology, she often stands apart from the quarrels and visible dramas of the other gods, and that restraint gives her a special serenity. In a mythology full of battles, feasts, seductions, punishments, and marvels, she represents continuity, hospitality, and the settled rhythm of belonging. The hearth would have been a place of cooking, offering, and shared daily life, where a family gathered and where a community recognized itself. Hestia's quiet importance shows that Greek religion was not only concerned with grand spectacle, it also honored the stable center around which ordinary life was arranged, the kind of calm presence that makes all the other parts of a world feel held together. Together, the Olympians do not simply divide the world into neat categories. They overlap, conflict, and mirror human experience in ways that are sometimes harmonious and sometimes tense. Their family resembles an enlarged and idealized society, with all its bonds, rivalries, obligations, and shifting loyalties. They quarrel, collaborate, love, assist, and disrupt one another, and that makes them feel less like abstract symbols and more like personalities embedded in a living order. This may be one reason they continue to feel recognizable long after the old rituals faded. They preserve the sense that life is never governed by a single force alone. There is music and law, wildness and home, war and making, desire and discipline, travel and rest. The Olympians gather these experiences into a divine household, not to make them simple, but to make them legible. And perhaps that is part of why Greek mythology has remained so compelling. It does not flatten human life into one clear answer. It lets many truths stand together, each with its own voice, its own shadow, and its own quiet light. Greek mythology is filled with places that are both physical and symbolic, and that is one of the reasons it has remained so vivid for so long. The stories are not set in a vague, distant realm. They are tied to hills, caves, islands, rivers, and city walls, as if the world itself were carrying memory. Mount Olympus is the clearest example. It is not just a mountain in a modern geographical sense, but the imagined home of the gods, a place lifted away from ordinary human life. Its height, its brightness in certain weather, and its difficult slopes made it feel naturally separate. Ancient Greeks did not need to imagine it as floating in the sky. Its summit, often hidden in cloud, and its remoteness from daily farms and roads, were enough to make it feel like a threshold between worlds. In poetry, that distance becomes emotional as well as physical. Olympus is not only above the land. It is above ordinary time, above hunger, above labor, above the small concerns that shape human life. And yet it remains tied to the earth, because the gods who live there still watch over harvests, storms, families, and kings. The underworld is equally important, but it carries a very different kind of meaning. It is not simply a place of punishment, even if later imagination often emphasized judgment and suffering. In Greek thought, the underworld was the region of the dead, governed in later tradition by Hades and Persephone, though the exact shape of the realm could vary from poet to poet and from city to city. Some souls were thought to sink into shadow and forgetfulness, others might remain as faint presences. A few, in special traditions, could receive a brighter fate in the Isles of the Blessed or other blessed regions. Greek ideas about the afterlife were never completely fixed, and that uncertainty is part of what makes them so haunting. Death was not always imagined as fire and retribution. It could also be an extension of separation, a slow dimming, a continuation beneath the earth. The underworld therefore becomes less about moral sorting and more about distance, grief, and the fragile persistence of identity. It is a place where the living cannot follow easily, yet cannot entirely stop imagining. Rivers in the underworld, such as the Styx, Acheron, and Lethe, give the afterlife a fluid and boundary-like character. Water in Greek myth often marks transitions, and this is true whether the water is bright and earthly or dark and subterranean. A river can divide life from death, memory from forgetfulness, or the human from the divine. Crossing is never casual. It changes the traveler. The Styx, for example, is not merely a feature of scenery. It is a sacred boundary, even an oath-bound force in some traditions, so that gods themselves are associated with swearing by it. Acheron often suggests sorrow or lamentation, a waterway of arrival and passage. Lethe, by contrast, is linked with forgetting, and the idea of drinking or passing through forgetfulness has echoed far beyond mythology into later literature and philosophy. These rivers make the underworld feel less like a single room and more like a landscape of thresholds. They suggest that death is not one event but several crossings, each with its own quiet danger. Caves and springs also appear again and again in myth, and they matter because they feel like openings into hidden layers of the world. A cave may shelter Zeus as an infant, as in traditions from Crete, where the god is concealed from his father's appetite and protected by attendants, drums, or the noise of ritual. That shelter is practical in the story but symbolic as well. It is a place of secrecy, gestation, and hidden power. Springs, too, can reveal divine presence or a nymph's domain. In a landscape where water might be scarce, a spring would naturally feel alive, cherished, and local. A place where water rises unexpectedly from the earth can seem like the earth itself breathing. That is one reason caves and springs are so often connected with prophecy, initiation, and transformation. They are neither fully exposed nor fully enclosed. They hold the quiet in-between space where gods can be sensed, where voices can echo, and where ordinary daylight becomes dimmer and more attentive. In folklore, such places are often associated with ancient memory, and Greek myth carries that feeling especially well. Sacred groves matter for the same reason. Trees, especially in older forms of religion, were not just scenery. They could mark divine presence or local holiness, and a grove could function as a living sanctuary before temples became dominant architectural symbols. The natural world was not neatly separated from worship. Instead, worship often took place inside nature, as if holiness and landscape were intertwined. A grove of oaks or laurels with filtered light and leaf shadow would naturally create a feeling of enclosure and calm. In myth, such places are frequently associated with nymphs, local spirits, and deities who are close to the earth. Some groves are remembered as places where vows are made, offerings are left, or stories are told softly in the presence of old trees. The sense of sacredness here is not always dramatic. It can be quiet and ancient, built from repetition, custom, and the recognition that certain places seem to deserve care. In this way, the grove becomes a reminder that Greek religion was often rooted in place rather than abstraction. Even islands occupy a special place in the mythic imagination. Because Greece is a land of coastlines and sea crossings, islands could feel remote, self-contained, and strangely enchanted. Many stories of gods, nymphs, and transformed mortals are set on islands where ordinary rules seem to loosen. The surrounding water makes those places feel protected and isolated at once. A person arriving by boat enters a different rhythm of life, one shaped by tides, distance, and weather. That physical separation suits myth well, because myth often needs a place where transformation can happen away from the main road of common experience. Some islands are associated with refuge, others with temptation, others with divine encounter. In the ancient imagination, an island might be a place where a hero washes ashore after shipwreck, where a goddess keeps company with companions, or where a strange local cult preserves older customs. Even when the stories differ, the underlying feeling is similar. The sea makes an island seem like a world within a world. Cities, too, were mythic spaces, and Greek mythology often explains them by linking them to divine or heroic beginnings. Athens, Delphi, Sparta, Corinth, and Thebes each developed their own legendary associations. Myth gave each city a sense of origin and identity, and it did so in ways that blended civic pride with sacred memory. A local hero, a sacred animal, a founding struggle, or a divine patron could link civic life to the larger order of the gods. In Athens, stories of Athene and the contest for the city help explain why wisdom and craft are so central to its self-image. Delphi is shaped by Apollo, prophecy, and the sense that speech itself can carry sacred force. Thebes gathers complicated stories of royal lines, divine interference, and human suffering. These civic myths are not just decorations. They help communities understand themselves. They tell people where they belong, what kind of ancestors they claim, and what obligations they carry. A city in Greek myth is rarely just buildings and streets. It is a living inheritance. This is one reason Greek mythology is so rich. It does not hover far away from geography. It attaches itself to cliffs, bays, rocks, mountains, and roads. The landscape becomes a memory palace where each place can hold a story. A traveler might pass a river and remember a boundary. A mountain might suggest a divine dwelling. A cave may hint at concealment or rebirth. A rocky shore may call to mind a shipwrecked hero or a waiting nymph. This layering of place and meaning makes the stories feel grounded but also luminous. The earth is not erased by myth, it is deepened by it. Every landmark seems capable of containing more than one truth at once, the practical truth of weather and terrain, and the symbolic truth of fear, longing, or reverence. That is part of the elegance of Greek myth. It turns the visible world into a field of remembered meanings. In that way, myth gave the Greeks a world that was at once real and enchanted, practical and symbolic. To walk through it in the imagination was to walk through a living map of meanings. A road was never just a road if it led past a shrine. A mountain was never only stone if it could be associated with a god's breath or a hero's trial. Even the most ordinary places could feel touched by story, and story in turn could make the land feel more intimate, as if the earth itself had known the events it contained. The Greeks lived among these landscapes, and the myths helped them read those landscapes with attention. The effect was not to make the world unreal, but to make it richly interpretable. It is a gentle kind of enchantment, one that invites listening rather than excitement, and as those places gather in the mind, they begin to feel less like settings and more like participants in the stories themselves. The mountain watches, the river divides, the cave shelters, the grove remembers, the island waits, the city inherits. In Greek mythology, place is not silent background. It is part of the speaking world, shaped by gods and heroes, and shaping them in return. One of the most enduring patterns in Greek mythology is the story of the hero who descends into danger and returns changed, as if the journey itself has reshaped the soul. In these myths, heroism is rarely a matter of simple triumph. It is more often a slow movement through pressure, uncertainty, and loss. Heracles, perhaps the most famous of all Greek heroes, stands at the center of this pattern. He is remembered for strength, but even more for endurance. His 12 labors are not just a list of daring feats. They form a kind of sacred ordeal, a sequence of near-impossible tasks that seem designed to strip away comfort and test the limits of body and will. He is powerful, but never untouched by effort. In many versions, the labor is not only to prove his might, but also to force him into a life of discipline after catastrophe. That detail matters because it gives his fame a quiet shadow. He does not simply choose greatness, he is made to walk through it. Heracles also shows how Greek myth blends glory and suffering so completely that the two can hardly be separated. He accomplishes astonishing deeds, yet his life is marked by punishment, error, and grief. The old stories often seem almost uncomfortable with his success, as if every brilliant act must be balanced by some painful consequence. That tension makes him more than a champion. He becomes a figure of burdened strength, someone whose victories arrive with a price already attached. Even when he is honored, he remains exposed to madness, regret, and the heavy consequences of divine conflict. The myths do not hide this cost. They place it in the center where it can be seen clearly. In later traditions, Heracles can appear almost elemental, like force itself given a human shape, but that force is never peaceful. It is always straining against something. Perseus offers a different kind of heroic image. Where Heracles is broad, relentless, and labor-bound, Perseus is associated with speed, divine gifts, and a single terrifying mission. He is the one who faces Medusa, the Gorgon whose gaze turns living beings to stone. The story often feels cleaner, more focused, as though it has been polished into the shape of a perfect adventure. Yet even there, the old pattern remains visible. He does not act alone. He receives guidance, equipment, and help from the gods. In some versions, Hermes lends his swiftness, Athene offers wisdom, and other divine figures provide the tools that make the impossible task possible. The myth quietly suggests that greatness is often a network of assistance, not a solitary flare of talent. Perseus moves through risk with caution and precision. He is the hero of timing, the hero of the carefully chosen moment. And after the danger, there is still the return, the carrying back of what was won, as if the victory must be folded into the world with care. Theseus, by contrast, is linked with Athens and with the city's own imagination of order, intelligence, and civic identity. His most famous episode involves the Minotaur and the labyrinth, one of the most enduring images in Greek myth. The labyrinth is more than a maze. It is a symbol of confusion, entrapment, hidden danger, and the difficulty of finding a path through complexity. Its winding passages suggest a world where direction is unreliable and certainty can vanish after a few turns. Theseus survives not by brute force alone, though he does possess strength, but by support, ingenuity, and the thread that allows him to find his way back. That detail is simple, but it is one of the most powerful in all the myths. A thread is ordinary, almost fragile, yet it becomes the difference between return and disappearance. The story quietly values both courage and orientation. It reminds us that bravery without memory can be lost, while wisdom can leave a path behind. In a mythic sense, Theseus does not merely defeat a monster. He learns how to move through confusion without becoming part of it. Jason and the Argonauts take the heroic pattern into another shape, one that feels larger, more collective, and more uncertain in its outcome. The search for the Golden Fleece brings together many figures, each with different strengths, temperaments, and skills. There are rowers, fighters, seers, musicians, and kings, sons, all set into motion by a difficult quest that can never really be reduced to one talent alone. This matters because Greek myth does not always celebrate the lone hero. Sometimes the ship itself becomes the center of meaning, a small moving world of alliances, tensions, ambition, and shared fate. The Argo carries not just people, but the fragile idea that a group can endure the sea together. The voyage is full of strange encounters, foreign lands, and moments when help seems uncertain or temporary. Jason's fame depends on guidance and on the labor of others, and that too is part of the old narrative honesty. The quest is grand, but it is never simple. The fleece gleams at the end like a promise, yet the path toward it is shaped by compromise, risk, and the delicate balance of human cooperation. Odysseus, though often associated with the later epic tradition, remains one of the most psychologically rich figures in all of Greek mythology. His defining qualities are not merely strength or courage, but adaptability, patience, and intelligence under pressure. He survives by reading situations carefully, by listening, by waiting, and by choosing the right form of action for the right moment. That makes him feel deeply human, because his victories often arise from judgment rather than force. In the wandering journey home, he becomes a hero of endurance, not conquest. The sea delays him, the gods obstruct him, strange people test him, and temptation pulls at him again and again. What is remarkable is not that he is flawless, but that he remains alert through long uncertainty. His story also carries a quieter emotional note, the desire to return to a place that memory has kept alive. Home is never only a location in these tales. It is a measure of identity, and Odysseus is one of mythology's great figures of longing preserved through distance. The great heroes often travel beyond familiar boundaries, because the edge of the world is where transformation tends to happen. In Greek myth, the comfortable center rarely creates revelation. Instead, revelation appears in forests, on stormy seas, inside caves, at the gates of strange palaces, or in the lands where normal human rules begin to loosen. Heroes fight monsters, but they also negotiate with kings, receive warnings from prophets, and encounter beings who are neither fully divine nor fully mortal. Sometimes they even descend into the underworld, where the dead remain in a dim and solemn order. These journeys reflect a deep mythic idea. Identity is tested at the margins. What a person is or might become becomes visible only when ordinary life no longer protects them. The boundary spaces of myth are not simply dangerous. They are clarifying. They remove what is unnecessary and reveal what can endure. Ancient audiences likely heard these stories not as distant fantasy, but as models for understanding human limits. A hero in myth is not just a figure of admiration. He is also a demonstration of what can happen when desire, duty, fate, and suffering collide. The stories would have been familiar in performance, in recitation, in civic memory, and perhaps in family telling, each version carrying its own emphasis. In that setting, heroic life is glamorous, yes, but it is also exhausting. It demands sacrifice, self-control, and the willingness to accept suffering as part of greatness. The heroes are praised, but they are also worn down. Their lives suggest that excellence in the ancient imagination is never cheap. It is earned under pressure, and it leaves marks behind. That is one reason heroic myths have lasted so long. They do not simply show victory. They show what victory costs and how fragile it can be when set against the uncertainty of the world. A monster may be defeated, but the wound of the struggle remains. A journey may end, but the traveler has changed. A return may be successful, yet not entirely restful. Greek myth understands this with unusual clarity. Its heroes shine, but they do not escape the conditions of being human. They are drawn through suffering, and what they gain is never separate from what they lose. In the calm after those stories, the hero does not feel triumphant so much as human, carrying the echo of every difficult road behind him, and the quiet knowledge that even greatness must pause and breathe. Many of the most famous Greek myths are also stories about transformation, and that may be one reason they linger so easily in memory. The Greeks had no single simple word for all the kinds of change these stories describe. They imagined shifting states through language of shape, form, becoming, and exchange, and they used those ideas to think about fear, desire, punishment, escape, and survival. In these tales, a person may become a tree, a bird, a flower, a fountain, a stone, or a star. The change is often painful, yet it is rarely meaningless. Something is lost, but something is also preserved. The body is altered, but the story keeps a trace of the person inside the new form. Daphne's transformation into a laurel tree is one of the best-known examples, and it has remained vivid for centuries because it carries both motion and stillness at once. In the familiar telling, Apollo pursues Daphne, and she flees until she can flee no farther. The ground, the air, the act of running itself all seem to narrow around her. Then the change arrives. Her limbs become bark, her hair becomes leaves, her arms lift into branches. Ancient audiences would have recognized that this was not just a magical ending, but also a strange kind of preservation. She is no longer human, yet she is not erased. She remains present in the laurel, and the laurel becomes a living reminder of her escape. Later Greek and Roman tradition would connect the laurel with Apollo, victory, poetry, and ritual crowns, which gives the myth an added layer of complexity. A tree that grows from fear and refusal becomes also a symbol of honor and divine association. The tension between loss and survival stays at the center of the story. Arachne's story moves in a different emotional direction. She is not pursued but judged. Her extraordinary weaving draws the attention of Athene, goddess of craft, intelligence, and disciplined skill. In the myth, Arachne does not simply work well. She works so well that her talent becomes a challenge. The contest that follows is often read as a warning about pride, but it can also be read as a recognition of human excellence. Arachne's weaving is not clumsy or careless. It is refined, detailed, and brave enough to depict the gods themselves with honesty that offends divine authority. When Athene transforms her into a spider, the punishment is fitting in form if not in justice. The weaver becomes a creature that spins threads from its own body. The image is elegant and unsettling at the same time. In it, Greek myth seems to say that skill is never neutral. Craft can be a source of beauty, but also of risk. Human creativity may resemble divine power, yet it remains vulnerable to divine anger. The spider in the corner of the room, working quietly in its web, still carries some of that ancient tension between art and punishment. Narcissus offers another path into metamorphosis, one that feels quieter on the surface but no less disturbing when considered closely. His story is usually told as a tale of beauty and self-absorption, but in older forms of the myth the atmosphere is more diffuse and less moralized. Narcissus encounters his own reflection in water, and the reflection becomes fatal because he does not recognize it as himself. The pool, still and bright, draws him into fascination. He bends over the surface, and the water gives back an image that cannot be touched. In that moment, desire becomes impossible to satisfy because the beloved object is only a likeness. The flower that later bears his name, whether understood as a narcissus or as some other spring bloom in ancient tradition, becomes a sign of fragile beauty and brief life. Later readers often turn the myth inward, making it about vanity or psychological self-love. But in the ancient world, it also belongs to a broader mythic pattern in which beauty, water, reflection, and disappearance are linked. The body does not endure as it is. It settles into a plant, a place of stillness, a natural form that quietly repeats the unreached desire of the original scene. Io's story stretches transformation across distance, which gives it a geographical as well as a bodily dimension. In many versions, she is changed into a cow and driven across the earth by divine force, especially under the watchful pressure of Hera. The myth is not only about shape-shifting, but about wandering. Io's suffering becomes a route. The landscape is marked by her movement, and rivers, straits, and regions are tied to her passage in later interpretation. Ancient storytelling often did this. It turned bodies into maps and journeys into explanations for place. The world in such a myth feels inhabited by memory. A river may not just be a river, it may remember a chase. A coastline may hold the trace of a frightened crossing. Io's story is therefore both intimate and expansive. Her transformed body is isolated, but it also connects far-flung territories. The myth gives suffering a kind of spatial echo. It says that pain can be carried across the earth and that geography itself may preserve the outline of a life. Callisto's transformation into a bear, and later her place among the stars, creates another layered image of change. Like Io, Callisto is pursued by divine attention and caught in consequences she does not control. In some versions, she is a companion of Artemis, set apart by vow and wilderness, and her pregnancy or violation leads to violent divine punishment. The bear form is fitting because it joins the human and the wild, the maternal and the dangerous, the familiar and the untamed. Greek myth often placed women at the boundary between these states, and Callisto's change makes that boundary visible. Later, her upward transformation into a constellation, or the placement of her image in the sky, gives the story a second life. The night sky becomes a memorial space. It is not only beautiful, but inhabited by old stories. Constellations in Greek thought were not just patterns of light. They were also acts of remembrance, often attached to tales of loss, rescue, or divine intervention. Callisto's bear, then, is not only on the earth, it is also above it, suspended in the human imagination, where the stars hold the shape of a sorrow that did not disappear. The constellations themselves are full of mythic echoes, and this habit of looking upward shaped the Greek sense of the heavens. The sky was never just empty space. It was a place where stories could be fixed without being fully closed. A star cluster might carry the memory of a hero, a hunted figure, a strange animal, or a divine event. This gave the heavens a narrative quality that felt both orderly and tender. The stars did not merely shine, they remembered. In many cultures, the sky is a place of distance, but in Greek myth it often feels strangely near, as though the mortal world and the divine world remain in conversation. The stars make that conversation visible. They keep forms after earthly change has done its work. In a sense, they are another kind of metamorphosis, not of flesh into bark or fur, but of story into light. Transformation myths also reveal how Greek thought could imagine identity as both stable and unstable at the same time. A person may be changed beyond recognition, yet remain recognizable in the telling. This is one of the quieter powers of myth. It allows a self to survive alteration. The human form may be lost, but the narrative preserves a recognizable thread, a gesture, a grief, a desire, a refusal, a name. Ancient listeners may not have needed a strict boundary between literal and symbolic here. The truth of the myth was partly in its emotional pattern. A transformed body could still express the personality, fate, or moral tension that mattered most. The tree still recalls the fleeing girl. The spider still recalls the weaver. The flower still recalls the gaze turned inward. The bear still recalls the woman who was not protected. The constellation still recalls the life that was carried upward. That idea may be one reason these tales feel so haunting even now. They suggest that change is not the opposite of meaning. It is one of the ways meaning survives. A myth does not always preserve a person by leaving them unchanged. Sometimes it preserves them by giving grief a different shape, one that can stand in the world longer than flesh can. Greek transformation stories are often unsettling because they do not let the original body remain intact, but they are also gentle in a strange way. They refuse complete disappearance. They make room for memory inside alteration. That balance between loss and endurance gives the stories their lingering calm. And so the old myths keep moving, not because they resist change, but because they know how to live inside it. The gods of Greek mythology were often worshipped through very practical rituals, and that practical quality is one of the reasons the religion can feel so immediate to us now. Offerings of food, wine, incense, and prayer linked human communities to divine powers in ways that were repeated, familiar, and deeply local. These rituals were not always grand ceremonies in marble temples, glittering with gold and carved stone. More often, they were small acts carried out in places that belonged to everyday life. A household might honor a god beside the hearth. A traveler might pause at a crossroads. A family might leave a gift at a modest shrine tucked beside a road or a field. In this way, myth and daily life were closely interwoven, not separated into distant categories. The divine world was imagined as near enough to be addressed, and the ordinary world was understood as full of sacred possibility. Even the simplest offering could carry meaning if it was made with attention, memory, and respect. Sacrifice played a central role in this religious world, though it can seem distant or unsettling to modern readers. Animal sacrifice, in particular, formed part of many public festivals and communal ceremonies. It was not thought of simply as destruction, nor only as an act of violence. Instead, it was structured as a shared exchange, one that affirmed community, hierarchy, and divine favor. The animal was prepared with care. The participants gathered. The ritual unfolded according to inherited custom. In some accounts and later interpretations, the gods received the fragrant smoke from the burning portions and the honor of the act, while humans shared the meat in a meal that followed. That meant the sacrifice was both sacred and social. It marked the gods' presence, but it also reinforced bonds among the living. The scent of smoke rising into the air, the sound of prayer, the warmth of the fire, and the distribution of food afterward all helped turn the moment into a collective memory. Even here, myth was not only told, it was enacted. Festivals created a calendar of divine presence, giving shape to time itself. In many Greek communities, the year was punctuated by processions, competitions, songs, athletic contests, and offerings that marked both the seasons and the civic order. Religion was not isolated from politics or art. Instead, it helped organize them. Athens, for example, honored Athene through the Panathenaea, one of its great festivals, which linked devotion, public identity, and civic pride. There were processions through the city, woven textiles, sacrifices, and gatherings that made the goddess's protection feel visible and shared. Festivals like this remind us that Greek mythology lived not only in stories about the gods, but in the rhythms of public life. People marched, sang, competed, and watched together. The city became, for a time, a sacred stage. The calendar itself seemed to pulse with divine attention, as though the gods were not remote rulers, but recurring presences in the ordinary turning of the year. Oracles were another important part of the religious landscape, and they reflected a different side of Greek religious imagination. The oracle at Delphi, associated with Apollo, became especially famous for cryptic responses that often required interpretation. People traveled there from far away, carrying questions about war, colonization, family troubles, leadership, illness, and uncertain futures. They came not because the oracle would always give a simple answer, but because ambiguity itself could be meaningful. A divine message might arrive as a short phrase, a symbol, or a warning that only made sense after events had unfolded. In this way, the oracle reminded seekers that wisdom often comes in fragments rather than in complete explanations. There is something quiet and almost meditative in that idea. Human beings ask for certainty, yet the answers they receive may demand patience, humility, and reflection. The sanctuary at Delphi became a place where people stood between hope and uncertainty, listening for a voice that belonged to the god but had to be understood by mortal minds. Dreams also mattered deeply in this religious world. Some sanctuaries offered incubation, a practice in which worshippers slept in sacred space in hopes of healing visions or divine insight. This could take place in a temple precinct or another holy setting where the boundary between waking and sleeping was treated as especially thin. The idea was that sleep itself might become a threshold between the human and the divine. In dreams, messages could arrive indirectly, as symbols, encounters, or felt impressions rather than spoken instruction. For people seeking relief from illness or guidance in difficulty, the night held a quiet promise. A person might lie down on a sacred floor or in a sheltered ritual area and wait in the dark with a mind full of questions. The experience would have been shaped by expectation, memory, and faith, but also by the ordinary mystery of sleep itself. In a world shaped by myth, the night was never entirely empty. It could be full of presence, even when no one else was awake. Prayer in Greek religion often involved reciprocity, and that structure gives it a clear emotional shape. Worshippers did not simply ask for help in an abstract way. They named the god. They recalled past favors. They acknowledged the deity's power and status. Then they asked for support in return. This created a moral and relational logic that was both practical and deeply human. The gods were not always imagined as gentle in a modern sense, and they were certainly not always predictable. Yet they were approached through respect, memory, and careful language. A prayer might sound formal, even restrained, because words themselves were part of the offering. To speak properly to a god was to enter a relationship shaped by obligation and gratitude. In this way, prayer was not only about requesting outcomes, it was also about maintaining a connection, one that had to be renewed again and again through attention. The calm cadence of a repeated invocation could make the moment feel balanced, as though speech itself were an offering laid gently into the air. Even household religion reveals how intimate the system could be. The boundary between mythic grandeur and daily routine was thin and often invisible. A simple flame on the hearth could carry sacred associations. A libation of wine poured onto the ground could acknowledge a divine presence. A spoken name could join an ordinary room to the wider order of the cosmos. In the home, religion was not necessarily performed on a grand stage. It was woven into meals, beginnings, departures, and moments of uncertainty. Families might honor protective deities, ancestors, or household spirits in forms that were small but meaningful. These customs helped make the unseen feel near. They also suggest that Greek mythology was not only a literature of heroes and gods, but a lived environment in which sacred attention could be turned toward a bowl, a doorway, a lamp, or a small altar. The domestic world, far from being separate from myth, was one of its most enduring settings. This is part of what makes Greek mythology feel so alive to later readers. It was never only literature, even though literature preserved many of its most famous stories. It was also action, repeated slowly across days and generations. The myths were told, recited, remembered, and performed in many contexts, from poetry and drama to ritual and festival. They were carried not only by famous authors, but by communal habits, local traditions, and shared assumptions about the gods and the world. The stories mattered because they were attached to practices. A tale about a deity could illuminate a rite. A rite could preserve the memory of a tale. Over time, the two fed each other. This is why the religion can seem so textured and human. It was not a system built only from doctrines, but from gestures, obligations, sense, and repeated acts of care. It lived in the pace of preparation and the discipline of custom. In that repeated rhythm, the ancient world becomes easier to imagine. There is smoke drifting upward from a sacrifice, and the soft murmur of people gathered together. There is the sound of footsteps in a procession, the measured beat of a festival drum, the hush that follows a prayer. There is the scent of oil, wine, and incense, and the cool dark of a temple interior. There is also the quieter space of a home, where a lamp burns steadily and a small offering is set down with a whispered name. Greek mythology in this sense was not only a world of dramatic intervention and extraordinary beings, it was also a world of routine devotion, of slow and careful contact between human life and divine power. That is what gives it such lasting atmosphere. It feels lived in. It feels remembered. It feels like a civilization listening, again and again, beneath a wide and patient sky. Greek myths were shaped not only by memory and imagination, but by the geography of the ancient Mediterranean itself. The world in which these stories lived was not still. It was crossed constantly by ships, footpaths, caravan routes, and seasonal journeys. Sailors carried tales from one coast to another. Traders repeated local legends in foreign harbors. Settlers brought with them the names of gods, the memory of sacrifices, and the outlines of heroic adventures. As these stories moved, they changed shape in subtle and sometimes dramatic ways. A deity honored on one island might become associated with a different place entirely. A local spirit could be merged with a more widely known god. A monster described one way in one region might appear with new features in another. Mythology was never isolated from movement. It drifted, adapted, and settled wherever people gathered and spoke. This is one reason Greek mythology can feel so layered. It does not come from a single origin point, as if it were written once and preserved unchanged. Instead, it resembles a shoreline that has been touched repeatedly by the sea. Each wave leaves a different mark. Some myths may preserve very old local traditions from the Bronze Age or earlier, while others were reshaped in the classical period by poets and religious communities who were already looking back across long distances. In some cases, a story seems to have traveled so often that its original form is hard to recover, and yet that uncertainty is part of its character. The myths were not fragile because they changed. They endured because they were flexible enough to move with people. Colonization helped carry these stories far beyond mainland Greece. From the 8th century BCE onward, Greek-speaking communities founded cities around the Mediterranean and the Black Sea. These settlements were not only places of trade and defense, they were also places where memory had to be rebuilt. People recreated temples, honored old gods, and told familiar stories in unfamiliar surroundings. A founding myth could be retold beside a new coastline, where cliffs, harbors, and inland hills gave the tale a different atmosphere. A hero associated with home might suddenly become relevant to a distant frontier. The act of settling a new land often invited mythic interpretation, because ancient communities naturally looked to stories when trying to understand where they were and how they belonged there. In those new places, older myths did not simply remain unchanged. They were often adapted to local conditions. A sea goddess might be invoked differently in a busy port than in a mountain valley. A heroic traveler might acquire new episodes connected to a colony's own history. Shrines were built, offerings were made, and sacred festivals were repeated in ways that linked the colony back to the mother city while still making room for the new environment. In this way, mythology became a kind of cultural thread. It tied distant settlements together without making them identical. A familiar name could be spoken in a new harbor, and the sound of it might carry both continuity and novelty at once. Among all these settings, the sea holds a special place in Greek myth. It is one of the great mythic spaces, a realm of passage and uncertainty. The sea can bring wealth because ships carry grain, oil, wine, metals, and precious goods. It can also bring danger because the same waters can swallow lives, scatter fleets, and separate families for years. It is a place of exile because one storm can carry a person far from home. It is also a place of rescue because ships may arrive just in time and distant islands may offer shelter. The sea is never emotionally simple in Greek mythology. It is both road and obstacle, gift and threat. That tension gives it lasting power. This is why figures such as Odysseus and Jason feel so deeply maritime. Their stories belong to a world that understands water as a force of connection and disruption. Odysseus travels not across a blank expanse, but across a living region full of gods, currents, islands, and delays. Jason and the Argonauts move through a seascape that seems to open and close around them, offering passage only to make that passage difficult. In many myths, the sea is not merely a setting. It shapes the logic of the story itself. Characters are tested there in ways that would not be possible on land. They must read signs, endure uncertainty, and trust forces they cannot control. That experience would have felt familiar to ancient audiences who lived near coasts and depended on travel by water. The Greek world was shaped by water in another sense as well. Islands, peninsulas, and narrow straits created a landscape of separation and proximity at the same time. A short journey by boat could link communities that would otherwise seem far apart. Yet a stretch of sea could also make a nearby place feel unreachable. Myth often captures this double feeling. It presents the sea as a boundary, but also as a bridge. That is part of why tales of voyages remain so central. They reflect a Mediterranean world in which movement was possible, but never guaranteed. Every crossing involved some risk, and every arrival carried a hint of relief. Winds, too, had divine significance in this imaginative world. Boreas, Zephyrus, Notus, and Eurus were not just names for directions on a map. They represented the felt presence of weather in daily life. Boreas, the north wind, could be sharp and biting. Zephyrus, the west wind, was often gentler and linked to the soft return of spring. Notus, the south wind, might bring heat or rain depending on the season. Eurus, the east wind, could feel unsettled or unpredictable. These figures gave personality to forces that ancient people experienced intimately. A breeze on a morning walk, a sudden change in the sky, or a hostile storm at sea could all seem like expressions of intention, mood, or divine action. This does not mean every ancient Greek imagined weather in exactly the same way. Some people may have treated winds as poetic beings, while others approached them more ritually or symbolically. But across these variations, the central idea remained powerful. Nature was not mute. It seemed to speak in patterns, omens, and sensations. The air itself could feel alive. In myth, this made weather more than background. It became part of the emotional environment of the story. A calm wind could promise safe passage. A contrary wind could delay destiny. A storm could signal the anger of gods or the fragility of human plans. The atmosphere of a tale was often inseparable from the atmosphere of the world in which it was told. Mountains and caves, especially those in remote places, also held deep mythic significance. These were not simply scenic locations. They were often linked to older local cults, early divine figures, and rites of initiation. A cave could be a place of concealment, where sacred things were kept hidden from ordinary sight. A mountain could feel elevated not only physically, but spiritually, as though it stood closer to the divine. The roughness of such landscapes was not considered a drawback. On the contrary, their difficulty made them feel more sacred. A place that required effort to reach could seem more worthy of reverence, more protected from ordinary use, and more likely to preserve ancient memory. In some traditions, caves were associated with birth, concealment, or underground powers. In others, they became places where young people passed through ritual experiences that marked a transition in status or understanding. The darkness of a cave could symbolize uncertainty, inwardness, or hidden knowledge. The height of a mountain could symbolize distance from everyday life, and perhaps from human limitation itself. These landscapes appear repeatedly in Greek myth because they offer more than visual drama. They create a sense of threshold. One enters them and does not remain exactly the same. That transformative quality may help explain why such places retained sacred importance for so long. Greek mythology also absorbed influences from neighboring cultures, and this exchange is one of its most interesting features. Contact with the Near East, Egypt, and Anatolia brought new images, motifs, and divine figures into conversation with local traditions. Some similarities were likely the result of direct borrowing, while others may reflect shared older patterns that developed in parallel across connected societies. Scholars still debate the precise roots of influence in many cases. What is clear, however, is that Greek myth did not grow in isolation. It was part of a broader ancient world of travel, diplomacy, trade, and storytelling. Ideas passed along with goods and people, and myths proved especially receptive to this movement. This does not make Greek myth less Greek. It makes it more historically real. Cultures do not remain pure and untouched unless they are cut off from life itself, and the ancient Mediterranean was anything but cut off. Greek poets and worshippers could recognize foreign forms without simply copying them. They could adapt them, reinterpret them, and fit them into local religious language. Sometimes a foreign goddess might resemble a Greek one closely enough to encourage identification. Sometimes a symbolic pattern would travel more easily than a name. The result was not confusion, but richness. Mythology became a living archive, capable of holding multiple layers of memory at once. Many legends of monsters and exotic journeys may also preserve traces of real contact with distant lands, though usually reframed through the language of imagination. When ancient storytellers described strange peoples, unusual animals, or far-off shores, they were sometimes working from rumor, partial observation, or second-hand reports. A traveler's memory could become a marvel by the time it reached a poet. A real geography could be transformed into a symbolic one. The unknown edge of the map became a place where story could grow freely. This is especially true in myths involving sea travel, where the horizon itself seems to invite invention. Beyond the familiar coast, the world becomes less certain and therefore more open to wonder. The known world did have edges in the ancient imagination, even if those edges shifted from one author to another. Beyond them, myth began to do what myth often does best. It named the feelings that arise when human knowledge grows thin. Fear, curiosity, longing, and expectation all gather there. A faraway island may contain a giant or a goddess. A narrow channel may hide a monster. A strange coast may reflect not just geographic distance, but psychological distance as well. In that sense, mythical journeys are never only about movement through space, they are also about movement through uncertainty. That sense of movement gives Greek mythology its wide horizon. The stories travel as far as the ancient world itself traveled, and perhaps farther in the imagination. They gather new forms as they go. They retain older shapes while making room for new ones. A hero who begins in one region may be remembered in another. A god may acquire local features in a distant settlement. A sea voyage may echo the roots of actual commerce, while also opening into dreamlike territory. This is part of what allows Greek myth to feel both rooted and expansive at the same time. It belongs to specific places, yet it never stays still. And in every harbour, the old names seem to return quietly with the tide. The Greek myths that survive today are not only about gods and heroes, they are also about human limits, especially the limits of knowledge, certainty, and trust. Again and again, the old stories return to the uneasy space between what can be seen and what can be believed. Cassandra is one of the clearest examples of that tension. In the familiar version of her tale, she is gifted with prophecy, yet doomed never to be believed. That contradiction gives her story its quiet force. She can perceive what is coming, but language fails to protect her from disbelief. She becomes a figure of tragic insight, one who carries truth without recognition. In later memory, Cassandra often stands for warning ignored, for knowledge made lonely. Her fate is not loud in the way battles are loud. It is quieter than that, and perhaps more devastating because it speaks to a deeply human fear that understanding is not always enough. To know the future does not always bring power. Sometimes it only brings helplessness and the burden of being right too early. Prometheus represents a different kind of defiance and a different relationship to knowledge. Where Cassandra suffers because she sees too much, Prometheus suffers because he gives too much. In the best-known telling, he steals fire from the gods and brings it to humanity. That single act makes him one of the great cultural figures of myth, because fire is never only fire. It is warmth in winter, a flame in the dark, a spark for cooking, a tool for metalworking, a means of protection and industry. In mythic terms, it stands for culture itself, for the step from exposure to making, from raw survival to transformed life. Ancient listeners would have recognized that fire changes everything. It gathers people together. It extends the day. It makes possible forms of craft and care that are difficult to imagine without it. Yet the story is not gentle. Prometheus's gift is followed by punishment, and the punishment is severe enough to remind us that divine favor and divine anger can exist in the same narrative, almost side by side. The image of his suffering lingers because it joins tenderness and resistance, generosity and pain. His story is one of the oldest meditations on sacrifice in Greek myth and one of the most enduring. Pandora's myth also speaks to the human condition, though in a more ambiguous and often more troubling way. In later retellings, her jar becomes a box, but the heart of the story remains the same. Something is opened and hardship pours into the world. The exact shape of the tale varies across sources, and scholars continue to note how much depends on the version being told, whether hope remains inside the vessel or lies outside it, whether it is preserved or released. That uncertainty is part of the myth's lasting power. Pandora herself is often treated as a figure of curiosity, beauty, and consequence, but the story is not really about blame alone. It is about how fragile human life is and how quickly a single action can change the texture of existence. Suffering enters the world, but so does endurance. Curiosity becomes dangerous, yet also undeniably human. The myth does not offer a simple lesson. Instead, it leaves us with a strange, enduring image: the opened vessel, the scattered burdens, and the small, difficult presence of hope near the center of it all. In that sense, Pandora's story feels less like an explanation than a meditation on the mixed condition of being alive. The Muses, 9 in number, govern song, memory, dance, history, and poetry, and their presence reveals something important about Greek ideas of creativity. The Greeks did not always imagine artistic brilliance as a purely private invention. Instead, inspiration could be understood as something received, a kind of contact with a divine source. The Muses are often associated with Mount Helicon or with springs and sacred places where thought seems to come more easily, as if the world itself were remembering. In the long tradition of epic and lyric poetry, a poet might begin by calling on them, asking for guidance, clarity, and a steadier voice. This tells us that art was not isolated from divinity. It was a form of relationship. Memory especially belongs to their sphere, which makes sense in a culture that preserved much of its history through oral composition and recitation. The Muses help to keep the past alive, but they also give shape to imagination. They stand at the boundary where recall becomes song, and song becomes something almost timeless. Their presence brings a gentler atmosphere into the myths, one in which creativity is treated not as a lonely struggle, but as a gift that arrives through openness. The Graces, too, represent an important aesthetic idea, though in a more delicate and social way. Beauty in Greek thought is often relational rather than isolated, and the Graces embody that quality. Gracefulness involves harmony, balance, and shared delight. It is not simply a matter of standing apart and being admired. It is the capacity to move through the world in a way that joins persons, objects, and gestures together. In art, in etiquette, in ritual, and in the pleasures of exchange, the Graces suggest that loveliness is connected to proportion and to reciprocity. Ancient images of them often show linked figures, standing close, turning toward one another, or arranging themselves in fluid symmetry. That visual pattern matters. It suggests that beauty is something circulated, something given and returned. In this sense, the divine world of Greek myth is not only violent, proud, and punitive, it is also elegant. It values charm, tact, rhythm, and the pleasing shaping of form. The Graces remind us that serenity can be sacred too, and that even the grand mythic imagination made room for softness. Even sorrow has a mythic pattern, and Niobe's story is one of the most haunting examples. After boasting of her children, she loses them, and grief transforms her into a stone image of mourning. The details differ from telling to telling, but the emotional outline remains steady. Abundance is followed by devastation, and the body becomes a monument to pain. It is difficult not to linger over the stillness of this image. In myth, transformation often follows action, but here the change seems to preserve suffering rather than release it. Niobe does not simply grieve and recover. She becomes the shape of grief itself. In some versions, even after being turned to stone, she continues to weep, and the source of her tears is imagined in a natural landscape, as if sorrow had seeped into rock and water alike. This is one reason the story has remained so memorable. It does not allow pain to vanish into abstraction. It gives grief a contour, a texture, a lasting presence in the world. The myths can be severe, but they are not emotionally distant. They understand that loss changes the substance of a life. Many myths turn on hubris, a word that suggests excessive pride or overstepping, but the Greek idea is richer and more exacting than the modern habit of using the word simply for arrogance. In the Greek imagination, greatness becomes dangerous when it forgets measure. A person may be capable, gifted, clever, strong, or admired, yet still fail if that excellence begins to trespass beyond what is fitting. Hubris is not merely confidence, it is a disturbance of proper relation. It can mean the kind of arrogance that provokes gods and ruins mortals, but it can also describe the larger failure to recognize limits. The myths repeatedly warn that action must be scaled to the human condition. That does not mean shrinking from achievement. It means understanding that achievement itself requires proportion. The heroic world is full of risks, yet not every risk is admirable. Sometimes the fatal mistake is not weakness, but too much certainty in one's own reach. This idea appears again and again because it was useful to the culture that told these stories. It offered a way to think about politics, leadership, war, and ambition without reducing life to simple praise or blame. That concern with measure runs through much of Greek culture, and the myths keep returning to balance, restraint, and the cost of excess. They do not reject achievement. On the contrary, they often celebrate courage, intelligence, endurance, and excellence of every kind, but they ask those qualities to remain in proportion. The heroes who move most memorably through these stories are rarely perfect. They are usually marked by tension, by a greatness that needs discipline, or by a brilliance that is shadowed by vulnerability. This is one reason the stories remain appealing across centuries. They do not imagine a world in which strength solves everything. They imagine a world in which strength itself must be measured carefully. In temples, in poetry, in public life, and in ordinary speech, Greek ideas of moderation helped organize the moral imagination. The myths absorb that atmosphere. They repeat it in dramatic form, offering examples, warnings, and elegant reversals. In that way, they still feel startlingly alive. Even when the names are ancient and the settings remote, the pressure of the stories is familiar. They speak to the same question again and again. How much can a person or a city or even a hero reach before the shape of life begins to break? The question is never answered once and for all. Sometimes ambition builds something beautiful. Sometimes it opens a path to ruin. Sometimes the line between them is impossibly thin. Greek myth does not pretend otherwise. It lingers in the space of uncertainty and asks us to listen there quietly without rushing. The answer is never entirely simple, and that uncertainty gives the stories their lasting depth. The myths survive not because they are neat, but because they remain alive to contradiction. They can hold sorrow and splendor in the same hand. They can honor cleverness while warning against overconfidence. They can imagine gifts that become burdens and punishments that reveal hidden truths. For that reason, these tales continue to feel less like distant relics than like old, dimly lit rooms we can still enter. In them, the ancient world keeps thinking aloud about what it means to be human, to desire, to fail, to endure, and to know when to stop. Greek mythology survived not because it stayed frozen in one original form, but because it was always being retold, reshaped, and carried into new settings. Ancient storytellers did not all tell the same version of a tale, and that freedom helped the myths last. A god could be given a slightly different family line in one city than in another. A hero might win glory in one poem and meet a quieter, sadder ending in a local tradition. The stories were stable enough to be recognized, yet flexible enough to change with the people who repeated them. That balance is part of what made them endure. Instead of belonging to a single author or a single official book, The myths belonged to memory, performance, and habit. They moved from hearth to festival, from spoken tale to written page, from one generation's understanding into the next. Roman writers later adapted Greek tales into their own language and worldview, often preserving the shape of the stories while changing the names, the moral emphasis, or the cultural setting. Much later, Renaissance painters and poets turned back toward these same figures, seeing in them an old world of grandeur, beauty, and symbolic depth. Even today, modern novels, films, and plays continue to reinterpret the old material. Each age notices something different. One age sees power, another sees desire, another sees family tension or grief or the loneliness of immortality. The myths remain alive because they can hold all of these meanings without breaking apart. That long survival also depends on the quiet labor of education and art, which preserved the myths long after the original religious world had changed. Temples once carried painted scenes and sculptural reliefs that taught stories through image as much as through ritual. A visitor might learn the shape of a myth by looking at a frieze, a statue base, or a decorated vase. In that way, art served as a kind of memory system. The myth of a god or hero could be recognized in a curve of posture, a familiar weapon, a gesture of mourning, a cloak, a wing, or a serpent. As Greek culture spread and later manuscripts were copied by hand, poems and plays also helped keep these stories intact. Even when temples fell into ruin and older rituals were no longer practiced in the same way, the images survived in fragments. A painted Athene could still communicate wisdom and protection. A medallion of Medusa could still suggest fear, danger, and the turning power of her gaze. Written words preserve sequence, but images preserve atmosphere. Together they made the mythic world durable. A story did not need to remain attached to one shrine to remain recognizable. It could live on in a vase painting, in a school lesson, in a copied poem, in a museum case, or simply in the memory of a shape seen long ago. Greek tragedy gave later audiences some of the most powerful ways to feel mythology, because it made old stories emotionally immediate and morally unsettled. Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides each took traditional myth and turned it into theatre that asked difficult questions about responsibility, suffering, and divine justice. These plays were not quiet retellings. They were public performances, heard in large open-air spaces where voices carried under the sky, and the audience sat together in shared attention. In that setting, the myths could feel both familiar and newly severe. A story everyone thought they knew might suddenly seem full of uncertainty. A divine command might clash with a human duty. A family might be torn apart by obligations no one fully understands. A hero might be admired and pitied at the same time. Tragedy often deepens myth by slowing it down, letting the audience dwell in the consequences rather than the action alone. The old tales of Oedipus, Agamemnon, Medea, and Antigone are not just plots. They are studies in irreversible choice. Once the decisive moment passes, it cannot be taken back. That feeling of permanence of a life changed beyond repair gives tragedy its quiet weight. Myth becomes not just a story of gods and heroes, but a mirror held up to grief, judgment, and the fragile boundaries of human understanding. Even the philosophers, who often preferred argument to inherited tale, did not fully leave myth behind. Some questioned the old stories because they seemed too human, too contradictory, or too morally troubling. The gods could appear jealous, deceptive, or inconsistent, and thoughtful writers sometimes wondered whether such stories should be believed in a literal sense. Yet myth remained part of philosophical language because it could say things that strict argument could not always reach. Plato is a strong example of this. In his dialogues, he often uses myths at moments when abstract reasoning reaches its edge. He tells stories of souls, justice, judgment, and the shape of reality in ways that are not presented as ordinary evidence, but as illuminating visions. These myths do not replace philosophy. They extend it. They give form to ideas that are difficult to hold in the mind all at once. A spoken image can carry a truth gently into memory where a formal definition might not linger. This shows that myth was never simply defeated by reason. The two often lived side by side. Rational inquiry and symbolic storytelling could both be tools for approaching the unknown. In the stillness of a late hour, that relationship feels especially fitting. Some truths are easier to think through in direct argument. Others arrive more softly, through image, metaphor, and narrative echo. The visual language of Greek mythology also helped the stories travel, because certain figures became instantly recognizable shorthand for entire worlds of meaning. Hermes with his winged sandals or his staff suggests movement, mediation, messages, crossings, and cleverness. Athene, often shown with helmet, shield, or aegis, condenses wisdom, strategy, and restrained power into a single presence. Apollo, with his lyre, brings together music, order, light, and a kind of formal beauty. Poseidon, holding his trident, belongs to the force and instability of the sea. Hades, less often shown but deeply present in the tradition, carries the quiet authority of the underworld and the finality of death. These images work almost like visual memory objects. A person does not need to remember every detail of a long story in order to recognize the meaning behind a symbol. A glance at a statue, coin, fresco, or vase can awaken a whole chain of associations. The ancient world understood this well. A god's attribute was not decoration alone. It was a clue, a condensed story, a way of seeing character made visible. Over time, these forms became so familiar that they outlived the specific contexts in which they first appeared. Even now, a pair of wings, an owl, a trident, or a laurel wreath can feel mythic at once, as though the old world is still quietly present in its symbols. Perhaps one of the most remarkable features of Greek mythology is how willingly it holds contradictions without trying to resolve them too quickly. The gods are magnificent, but they are not simple ideals. They can be generous and punishing, radiant and remote, protective and dangerous. Heroes are often brave, but they are also wounded by pride, anger, grief, or fate. The underworld is a place of loss, yet within the mythic imagination it can also be governed, ordered, and even strangely dignified. The sea may promise roots, trade, and abundance, while at the same time threatening wreckage and sudden disappearance. Greek myth rarely smooths these tensions away. Instead, it lets opposite qualities sit beside each other. This is part of its enduring richness. The stories seem to understand that life itself is mixed. A single figure can inspire admiration and caution. A single place can be beautiful and fearful. A single victory can carry the seed of sorrow. Rather than forcing the world into neat categories, myth preserves its complexity. That is one reason the stories feel so human, even when they speak of gods. They recognize that reality often contains more than one truth at once. The long life of these myths also comes from the way they invite repeated reflection rather than quick closure. A story of transformation, revenge, exile, or divine encounter can be told many times and still feel slightly different in each telling. A reader in one century may notice the political meaning of a myth. Another may focus on family loyalty. Another may hear in it an echo of trauma, or the dream logic of the unconscious, or the sadness of growing old. These different responses do not cancel one another out. They gather around the story like layers of light. The flexibility of myth makes it almost like a living archive. It stores emotions, structures, warnings, and hopes without reducing them to a single lesson. This is one reason scholars continue to study the myths carefully, even when the texts are fragmentary or the historical background is uncertain. Some stories survive only in brief quotations. Some exist in later summaries that may not preserve the oldest version. Some details are debated because the ancient evidence is incomplete. Yet even uncertainty adds to the atmosphere. It reminds us that these tales were never meant to be perfectly sealed objects. They were part of a larger cultural conversation, one that unfolded over centuries and across regions. Greek mythology also survived because it was woven into ordinary learning. Children heard names, family relationships, and heroic deeds as part of education, recitation, and shared cultural memory. Poets repeated genealogies. Teachers explained allusions. Artists portrayed recognizable episodes. Public ceremonies kept certain associations alive. In this way, the myths were not only monumental stories of distant gods, they were also part of daily literacy in the ancient world. A person encountering a poem or a sculpture could be expected to know something of the background. That expectation made the myths feel present and communal. It is easy now to imagine them as remote relics, but for long stretches of time, they were the common language of thought, art, and celebration. Even when people doubted the literal truth of a story, they still used it as a reference point. A myth could explain a landscape, a custom, a family name, or a city's identity. The stories were both narrative and inheritance. They stayed close to the world because the world itself kept calling them up. Their endurance in later centuries also owes something to the comfort of recognition. To encounter Greek mythology is often to sense that one has entered a familiar landscape, even before all the details are clear. Certain names sound as though they belong to deep memory: Zeus, Hera, Demeter, Artemis, Dionysus, Odysseus, Persephone. The stories carry rhythm and pattern, and that pattern can feel restful. There is an order to divine family quarrels, labors, journeys, and returns. There is also an order to the more unsettling parts, where fate overtakes intention or a warning goes unheeded. The mind can settle into that structure because it is both expansive and bounded. It opens onto gods, monsters, kingdoms, seas, and underworld paths, yet each tale has a shape that can be followed. This is part of why the myths can feel especially gentle late at night. They do not demand urgency. They invite wandering thought. They allow the listener to drift through old names and images the way one might drift through dimly remembered corridors of a house seen long ago. And as the night grows deeper, these myths seem less like distant inventions than like a shared human inheritance, carried forward in stone, in ink, in paint, in speech, and in the quiet discipline of remembering. They continue to speak not by insisting on one meaning, but by offering many softly and at once.